It's such a pleasure to have today a conversation with Vitali Braun, who I met last year during a space debris conference in Darmstadt, and who is an insanely educated and knowledgeable about so many stuff, so many topics about space and space debris, and very impressive and very enjoyable to talk to him. And I hope he can shed some light today on some of the issues. What is space debris? And why should we care? Just to start off with a cheeky question, so to say.
Hi, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So we start with what is space debris?
What is space debris? And yeah, and maybe you can also point out why we should care about it. I just wanted to have this cheeky question just
Yes.
very much at the beginning.
Yes. And it's actually not the easiest question because we have some notion of what debris is also from our day-to-day life. You know, what is rubbish or what is trash and what can be thrown away and what not. And if you look at space, it's basically also everything that has been left behind from spaceflight missions. So this can be satellites that are no longer used. It can be rocket stages that brought the satellites up there and then were discarded too, and then they keep orbiting up there. But then also there's other elements. Think of solid rocket motors, for instance, that might burn and create dust particles, pretty similar to the particles that we also have when engines here on ground are burning. Other residues, for instance, fragments that can result if something explodes or things are colliding and shattered into pieces, then you suddenly also have more trash out there. But when it comes to actually the discarded satellites, it's sometimes not so easy to judge whether something is already space debris or whether it's still of use up there. One example are special objects that have been launched. They're called calibration targets. They can be, for instance, just metal spheres, and they're out there. And for like a normal observer, they might look like something that someone put there, and it's just looking like a sphere and not fulfilling any other purpose. But what they do is they basically use radars on ground to target those spheres, and then they get an echo from them, and then they can assess how good their radars are performing. So they have been brought up there basically to calibrate radars on ground. And then, but they are the same spheres. They've always been the same. So they might be up there for decades and you just don't know whether they are still being used as calibration targets or not. So while for some objects, it may be very easy to tell it's trash, there is also some for which it's very easy to tell it's active satellites, so still useful ones. And then there's something in between where you're not always sure, or you can't always be sure whether it's already something that is debris or not. Now, this space debris can be generated or up there in a size range. That's also something we model from micrometer sizes. That's the dust particles. It can be flecks of paint, for instance, or any other materials that degrade from surfaces, for instance, plastics, for instance, due to the exposure to the environment up there. And also then you come to higher object sizes in the millimeter regime. This can be little fragments or bolts or anything that's flying around there. Then we come to centimeter-sized objects and larger ones, and up to active satellites. So it's a broad range of object sizes. And when we come now to talk about what the hazards actually are, there's two main categories. Or why should we actually worry that it's up there? You know, we are down here and it's not much of a problem. So first of all, the things are peacefully orbiting there, but not all of them, because some of them are coming down. They're returning to Earth after spending some good time up there. And they can also reach ground. So a lot of space debris has actually been retrieved or found on ground. Like, for instance, tanks and other components that are very likely to survive the atmospheric re-entry. So this is a phase where your spacecraft is exposed to a lot of heat and pressure. Many materials are just then demising, in a sense that they're just burning up and nothing remains to reach ground. But some components that are designed to resist these conditions, especially those in the coming from related to the propulsion system. You can imagine nozzles or tanks or other pressure vessels, for instance. They come down, they reach ground, and then they might hit someone. So this is basically the direct threat to people on ground. So far, no one has been.
What's the likelihood of that?
It's very low. Sometimes people relate this to the same likelihood of being hit twice by lightning in your life. But I think there were already people who were hit twice by lightning. I don't know. So yeah, but what we also did, to give you some numbers, was to simulate, for instance, the entire history of spaceflight until today and all that stuff that came down since 1957. And we basically have the means to compute the likelihood that someone on Earth will be fatally injured or dies due to such an impact. And we accumulated all of this. And what we came up with was that since 1957 until today, more or less one person should have died statistically. Now, this doesn't sound like it's too much. And in fact, right now, basically the chances that you die are really, I don't know, almost non-existent. So you're much more likely to die of many other things. But what we also see is that we extrapolate the current visions, let's say, of what people want to put up there. Space traffic is increasing significantly, especially with the large constellations being brought up. And there are already some first analysis that indicate that if we continue putting those up, then by 2050, that was one of the analysis I have in mind right now, it might be that just by having one constellation with tens of thousands of satellites, we might already have the case where every year in 2050 again, there will be a likelihood of 50% that one person on this planet will die due to debris that reaches ground. And this is already quite some change in how space will be perceived, I think, because right now, basically no one on ground is affected. But if we reach a stage where every year you basically flip a coin to see if someone will die on this planet, I wonder whether people will think differently about, yeah.
Well, considering
or forward, no.
Yeah, remembering the movie Gravity, I would think that the likelihood to get killed by space debris for an astronaut might be unproportionately much higher. So I guess that would be probably a more direct threat, right? That space debris interferes with any activity in space directly.
That's exactly the second category I was referring to, and these are the collisions in space. First, it's of course the astronauts that might be directly exposed to this. At the International Space Station, it's actually a quite benevolent environment, let's say, different to what we saw in Gravity, which was a bit exaggerated in that sense. But the International Space Station is flying relatively low in a low Earth orbit where the atmosphere is still wiping a lot of debris out. So there's basically no debris living or residing in those orbital altitudes. Only stuff that comes from above and transits through that altitude region is able basically to interfere with the ISS and poses a threat to the astronauts. But then also, because it's quite close to the Earth, you can better track little objects because they're closer. Radars are more sensitive to the smaller stuff that might be around the ISS or coming close to it. If you're further away, you have more difficulties of tracking those objects. Then they also take precautionary measures on the ISS. If astronauts are working outside the modules during extravehicular activities, they also tend to be rather protected by those modules. You have to imagine the ISS is flying, and then all the stuff usually comes like with your car if you go on the streets and collect all the insects with your windshield. Well, nowadays maybe less insects.
Back in the days, that was the case.
Back in the days before, when we still had insects.
Exactly.
And with space debris, it's similar. So you will absorb a lot of stuff that's coming in flight direction. So the astronauts would rather be working behind the modules so that they are kind of shielded to some extent. But then comes the second part, and this is not like the direct threat to the astronauts that might die due to impacts. But if we go in higher altitudes where we operate a lot of satellites, they are exposed to a collision threat by debris. So satellites might also die in some sense, and this results in a mission loss. For instance, a satellite will be destroyed, and this might impact on services that those satellites provide. Whenever a satellite is destroyed, it creates a fragment cloud, and those fragments themselves, they continue on those orbits and threaten other satellites. This is to some extent what was exaggerated in gravity, the so-called Kessler syndrome, collisional cascading effect. And some people believe it's unfolding right now already on a much, much longer time scale than the 90 minutes that we had in gravity. But it's basically slowly degrading the operational environment for all the other satellites. So it means if you want to operate a satellite today, you will have a certain cost to basically account for the damages that may occur due to debris or some risk of losing even your mission. You might have to pay an insurance, for instance, that tells you, okay, there's a 6% risk that you lose your mission over 10 years. This is the premium you have to pay. But if we go like now 30 years further and extrapolate the scenario, the conditions will be much worse. So the risk might be, I don't know, 10% or even higher. So it means that for everyone here on ground, the cost of operating satellites actually increases just because the environment is more and more polluted through such fragments.
Since you already mentioned it, the Kessler syndrome, what is the range of scenarios that exist there to elaborate on how it will unfold, or as you already said, apparently already unfolding, and what is the time frame there? Let's say conservative numbers. How far are we away from such a cascading effect, fully dismantling any opportunity for space activities? So as the worst case scenario.
The timescales are quite interesting. So let me start first with the analysis that have been done. And they are quite interesting studies that were conducted by different teams worldwide in the early 2000s. And what they came up with, and this was the interesting conclusion, they basically simulated what happens if we continue operating spacecraft the way we did on a global level. And we see basically a runaway situation in the sense that because of all the stuff that's already up there, if we extrapolate, we will see more and more collisions. So the exponential growth applies then to the number of fragments that will be in orbit that themselves then trigger new collisions, which result in fragments and so on. And then this is multiplying. So you have more and more collisions and more fragments. So what they then did, and this was the more remarkable result, was to say, what if we stop launching altogether and stop spaceflight activities, let's say in 2010. And then we saw that the space debris environment in terms of object numbers is still growing, even in the scenario where we wouldn't do anything. And this is because there's already enough stuff up there that keeps multiplying. Now, in some sense, and some critics might say, this is still acceptable because this growth takes place over, let's say, many decades or centuries, and we may adapt in the sense that we become better in monitoring debris, we become better maybe in shielding spacecraft, and then it's like the numbers themselves, so how much debris you have up there, don't necessarily tell you how well you can live in such a scenario. So if you also become better in seeing where all that stuff is and you are better in avoiding it, then you can still operate spacecraft very well. So it boils down a bit to discussing like carrying capacity or how many satellites can actually operate in a certain environment, given maybe even my culture or my approach to how I operate satellites. So this is one thing. And then, as I said, it was a bit dramatic to see that it even keeps increasing if we don't launch anything. In that sense, we have somehow messed up already. In some areas, especially at altitudes between 700 kilometers above the Earth's surface to 900 kilometers surface, we saw this effect being the strongest one. even to the extent that some people in the community already say that at some point, probably, because obviously we continue launching stuff, that we have maybe to declare a dead zone in that region very soon, similar to the dead zones that we also have in oceans everywhere. For space, it will basically mean that no satellites will go there. It has a direct impact because it's like a preferred altitude shell to operate Earth observation missions from, those that actually provide us with the important data to understand climate change and keep monitoring it. They have to go elsewhere then, and basically have again a degraded mission scenario in some sense, because you have to adapt to another orbit. So this is what happened, and then people suggested that we have to start removing stuff up there, so that potential collision partners that in the future may trigger those collisions that we saw in simulations are removed from the environment, and then basically we are remediating again, so that eventually the trend is not like increasing still in the no further launch scenario, but maybe keeps stable, or even we start cleaning the environment. Now, the problem is that after the 2010s, we saw this huge boom in the space sector due to miniaturization. For instance, satellites got much more affordable. Digitalization brought many other trends with it, and you could deliver many new services with satellites that before were basically too expensive, I think. So instead of not launching anymore, we launched even more. So this is sometimes a bit of the ironic.
Yeah, so in consideration of this perverted economic incentive structure that we are witnessing in every industry and every part of our life, so we should assume that this won't stop anytime soon. So there will be a continuation of launches. So what is known about second and third order effects, so to say, that might arise from these activities, and most possible and probable intensification of space debris? So how will we be affected by space debris and by dead zones in the future as a society? And because apparently there's a lot of satellites active satellites that are actually helpful to our everyday routines. But what happens then?
Yes, no, that's the good question. We have to think first of the services that those satellites provide, and they are basically quite essential for a society that is very much based on that technology. Think of weather predictions, for instance. They are based on satellite data and used then, for instance, to do weather forecasts over the oceans. That's information that is otherwise difficult to acquire. And you needed to basically plan like transatlantic flight routes for the planes or redirect them. So what this basically means is that if you have good or accurate data available from satellites, you can have more planes crossing the Atlantic, so to say. If you have less of them, then you probably require other means of performing weather prediction, and could impact basically the flight corridors that exist. So in some sense, an intensification in space traffic from the weather perspective allows you to intensify even flight routes on Earth. Now, there's other aspects like telecommunications. Think of the Starlink constellation, which is basically suggesting, or SpaceX is suggesting, they might provide high bandwidth internet to all places all over the world. So suddenly these services will be provided from space, which so far were ground-based infrastructure. And then again, the question is, how much do we become dependent on these services? So far, I think probably more than 90% of the internet traffic is routed still through submarine cables. But if people figure out, oh, it's much cheaper to do via space, I wonder how much redundancy will be left in those submarine cables, and if at some point everything is basically put into orbit. And then the question is how much we become dependent also on that infrastructure, and how resilient it is towards basically these debris scenarios. Because if you operate a constellation up there, you have to make sure also that you dispose of the satellites that are part of your constellation after the mission is over. And if one of the Starlinks, for instance, in their altitude band fragments or has a collision with some debris and there's a fragment cloud, it will immediately have an impact on all the other Starlinks in that same altitude shell. And you may have even subsequent collision events for the still active satellites. So there might be some chain reaction ongoing too.
So I'm interested in hearing how important are alternative images of the future for your industry, and also what would then be the budgeting to make these alternative future more likely to happen, to design and maybe also direct the timeline towards, or create different timelines, different possible future scenarios. And do you have any information about that?
That's a really good question, because when you speak of possible futures, there can be a very broad range of futures, right? For instance, if we look at space, in those analyses I mentioned, there was the no further launch scenario. So if we ask ourselves, would we actually accept a scenario where we don't launch anything anymore because there's, for instance, too much debris, and we decide like for a few centuries to let the environment clean itself, and then maybe we start later on again. But what would it mean for us? And I think it's quite difficult at the moment, because it rather goes in the other direction, that we become more and more dependent on space infrastructure. So there's somehow already one scenario which probably is off the table or not really discussed. Similar maybe to discussions in the domain of climate change, where there's actually also the option of deindustrializing, but it seems like this is also not necessarily the option, or rather with the sustainable development goals to achieve that other countries also industrialize, but somehow in a green way. And so I see that we somehow limit ourselves on futures that include a lot of space flight activity. And in that sense, I also have my strong concerns that the problems there will also like just multiply, because there will be a lot of space activity in the near Earth orbits, new problems that we have to tackle with. So how to coordinate those thousands of satellites. And if people mention the democratizing of space, you have also to imagine that there will be hundreds of operators that have never come in touch with each other, but suddenly you have to sit here and maybe coordinate a call with someone in Peru or I don't know, Angola, and ask them what their plans about their satellite is, people you have never met in your life before, or maybe you even have language problems. And then you have also to understand how they operate their spacecraft. So a lot of things. And then if it also goes to the moon, for instance, we will have also a lot of traffic basically in the lunar region, or the orbits around the moon and from Earth to the moon. And somehow we have to keep track of all that traffic. And it gets increasingly difficult, because so far everything we do in monitoring is relying on ground-based radar and telescopes. And those, for them, it will be increasingly more difficult the further away stuff is from the Earth. So I wonder how around the moon, basically, we would want to monitor this. And this could imply that you have to put also radars and telescopes then on the moon just to monitor the debris around there.
In different industries, there are usually also these kind of out of the box type of ideas being floating around, or like communicated. For instance, in regarding radioactivity there to illustrate or to warn people in the future that might not be able to read our symbols anymore. There are ideas that, you know, you could genetically engineer cats and make them glow when they are nearby any radioactive material. So I was thinking, what about those outlandish and insane ideas? I don't know, bringing up a magnet or a huge, gigantic chewing gum with super glue to catch the space debris. Are these kind of ideas floating around, rumored to be possible game changers, or is that not necessarily be part of the daily discussion, since probably you are all very busy monitoring space debris directly every day?
So if we take, for instance, the two suggestions you made on the magnet and the chewing gum. So for the magnet, one difficulty is that first, the materials are not necessarily ferromagnetic. That is, if you take aluminium, for instance, you cannot attract it with a magnet. But there is debris, of course, that is magnetic. But then the problem is that they are flying so fast. It's basically like a bullet crossing your path, and then you can imagine that if you have a magnet, you basically don't do much to a bullet that just passes by. So you have to basically catch up in the sense that you have to attain the same speed as that bullet first, and then with your magnet you may grab it. It's still energetically very expensive. And then similar, basically you don't need a magnet then, but can just maybe have an astronaut or a robotic arm and then collect it too. In fact, those ideas with robotic arms are around, but again, for each debris piece, you basically have to navigate there first and attain that same orbit, that is speed of that object, and then collect it. And then go to the next one, to the next bullet that is somewhere out there. For the chewing gums, you basically need a huge collecting surface. Those ideas are also around. You have a large structure in space, and then everything that impacts basically stays in that mass. But again, the problem here is that you either build a super huge structure, I don't know, square kilometers large, and this no one did so far, to be effective in some sense, because otherwise the space up there is so huge, and the millimeter-sized objects that you want to target with this, for instance, are so many. We speak of 130 million objects that are out there. And we can simulate, for instance, if you have 1 square kilometer of surface, you maybe collect thousands of them, or even if it goes to hundreds of thousands, it's still on the order of hundreds of millions what's up there. So you don't achieve that much for the effort you put. And then the structure up there is also subject to a collision with larger stuff. So you always have this kind of problem. So what is usually recommended is that you target the big stuff, like entire satellites, and remove them because they're easy to be seen. You can go there, you can grab them, because the large satellites are actually the source of debris, of the small debris in the future. So if you remove them, they will not produce any paint flecks or any other ejecta particles when something impacts, or other fragments when they completely disintegrate. So this is the, let's say, the main line of thought of how to mitigate future space debris. You basically remove the progenitors, let's say, or the parents that may generate new debris.
So basically the old James Bond idea, right? So yeah, that's interesting. But I think that a lot of these ideas are actually quite old, so to say, right? I just recently heard that even the space elevator, which seems so super high-tech futuristic, is actually an idea that appeared the first time in 1895. Yeah, I'm thinking also regarding what you already mentioned with colonizing the moon. First of all, I guess for two reasons, probably to have the dark side of the moon in order to look out into deep space, and then also to use it probably as a pit stop to get to Mars. So we will see this happening eventually, right? The intensification to try to colonize moon. So will there be a problem getting to the moon even when we have this accelerating intensification of space debris?
I sometimes indeed wonder. So first of all, why getting to the moon, so to say? Because in the end, if you want to go there, okay, and you now said maybe then it's cheaper to go to Mars from there. That's also the line of argumentations that some people use.
That's
That
what
you also learn
that's what
that.
I've been told. Yes, that's true.
Yes, yes. And but then again, you might ask, why are we going to Mars, and what are we going to do there? For instance, for the moon, it's been argued that there's resources that we could be mining, for instance, to build spaceships again to go to Mars. But it always boils back or falls back to the point like, why are we doing all of this, or why would you go to the moon? Once you have a camp, for instance, on the moon, or there's people living there, you basically come into another dilemma of having to permanently supply this, which might come with a huge of cost because you don't want the people to die. So you create some dependency, so to say, that you have to do suddenly all that mining to sustain the life on the moon. Because they are very unlikely to become self-sustainable. You cannot easily grow stuff on moon, or maybe it takes, I don't know how many centuries to become self-sustainable there. And even worse on Mars, well, maybe not worse, but it's farther away. So if you have colonies there, you also have to supply them from Earth. And this will be super expensive. So from my point of view, I never understand like, why are we doing this actually?
Well, I thought that the moon is interesting because it's entirely made out of cocaine, and some people want to go up and snort that stuff. No, I have no idea.
Probably the
But
super
you're
rich
right.
people, they go there. Yeah,
You're right. There are narratives being in circulation that seem attractive, probably, and also are framed in such a way that they attract especially investors, because like who doesn't want resources as someone who has an interest in getting a hold on resources. But it seems a little bit outlandish to mine a moon, right? I mean, isn't there a strong dependency for our tidal waves and anything that is happening with our oceans? So why would you want purposely shrink that thing? I don't know. It's a little bit twisted, isn't it?
it is, and I think it's also, yeah, I still see it as a very expensive endeavor to go to the moon and then bring resources back to Earth, because I would think that this is the most straightforward way of seeing the use of those resources. But I think the main line of argumentation is that those resources that are mined there are then used for a space economy. But then also the question is that space economy is there for what? To do the mining, and then you have the mining which is there for the space economy, and then it's like a circular loop that you create there that actually is not needed overall. I don't know if it affects that much the tides in the end, but what I've also heard is that if you do mining activities there, there will be a lot of dust that is produced, that is then, because of the lower gravity field of the moon and the lack of the atmosphere, basically you will have a layer of dust surrounding not only the mining pit, I think, or several of them that might be out there, but maybe you will also see this from the Earth, that the moon suddenly has like a cloud of dust around, and this changes the picture for the people here on ground of how the moon actually looks like. It's like maybe it starts looking even more blurry, and like my background right now.
Yeah.
And these are all kind of aspects that also come into my mind there.
So we are basically coming back to the question, why are we doing that? And what's the value? What's the purpose? What's the meaning of it all? Where is it directed towards? And I would assume that there are two grand narratives. One was always space exploration, because there's a romanticized version of it that we might eventually one day become interstellar or something like that, technologically advanced. And then there's the other one, as you also already mentioned in your explanations, that there's a need to monitor Earth for reasons to to understand climate change, to understand environmental degradation, the state of the oceans, and so on and so forth. So how much is it really about that, and how much is the business maybe also changing? Because I assume there are also other reasons to go up into space. There are other interest groups that have a financial incentive. What is there as an information that you could share with us?
From my point of view, we have many more salient problems to solve here on Earth when it comes basically to climate breakdown and all the stuff this implies, biodiversity loss. I mean, the whole degradation of entire ecosystems and the planetary boundaries that we are exceeding. And these are, for me, problems that are very urgent and need to be addressed. And that's why I see actually benefit in those space missions that we come up with that help us in addressing them. But to me, they seem not to be the main component of what is being put up in space, because there's still a larger drive for space exploration, as you mentioned, but also the militarization of space. Geopolitical conflicts that exist here are somehow even further intensified through the militarization of space. In my point of view, it would make much more sense to focus basically on those Earth observation capabilities and figure out together what exactly we need to, which missions we need to put up there, and to sustain, basically to have a supply with that information we need to tackle those problems.
Is that kind of focus and that kind of priority, is that common? Is that being shared by everyone in the field? I mean, you mentioned the military interest, and obviously there's an intensification, which we are now witnessing also as civilians. But what is the common ground that we can find to really prioritize that what seems to be urgent and important?
Maybe we do this in the next call, Daniel, because I see it's now
Right.
stopping.
Thanks for the reminder.
Question.
Let's do that.
Okay.